Hi, welcome to the Global Grid Experience. Maybe I came in too hot there, but I'm excited you're here as always. Thank you for listening. My guest today is Dennis Jacobs. Dennis is a retired physics professor, pilot, and aeronautical engineer. He's the author of multiple books, including The Search for Science and From McEnergy to EcoEnergy, America's Transition to Sustainable Energy, co-written with Sociology Professor and wife, Dr. Karen Branden. He and Karen built and live in an environmentally friendly house in northern Minnesota. I could talk with Dennis about a kazillion awesome topics, but I asked him what he's most passionate about sharing and sees as a major concern when it comes to the environment. His answer, the rise of populism. So let's begin. Hi, Dennis. How are you?
Really fine. Thank you, Erica.
Thanks for joining. I'm so excited you're here. First of all, can you explain what is populism?
Yeah, how I see it. And, one thing I want to make clear is that when I get into populism and things that I just do a lot of reading about, there's a lot of opinions on that. And so I really welcome anybody listening, if they disagree or agree, to kind of check on what I'm saying, how they see it. But really, the basic form of populism is just appealing to the population. And we've had it forever. I mean, it's been around no matter what form of government, no matter what it is. We get all politicians or people in power try and use some form of populism. And the thing is, sometimes you'll get a leader who is a very good critical thinker who can take a complex idea and offer it in a fairly straightforward manner where he brings people along with him in understanding the complex problem facing society. But so often we get people who really don't understand the problem that much and try and offer simplistic solutions, simplistic ideas to problems facing us. And they do it in the name of they want to gain more power. So we see in the world today very much a rise in populism. And that's both on the left wing, right wing. You get scientific populism, you get economic populism. And I see this as offering solutions to complex problems in a very simplistic, unrealistic manner. And again, we see this all over the world. I think it was H.L. Mencken who said, for every complex problem, there's a simple, straightforward, and wrong answer. And that's what we see. Quite often, populism will come with a lot of blaming of people. If there's any problems with society, they'll blame a common one is immigration. And we see that all the way back. Mussolini demonized the Ethiopians coming into Italy, and that was part of his populist movement. Hitler uses the Jews to blame. And you get that even all over Europe now. When we see right-wing or left-wing populism, we see them a lot of times blaming immigration. And that's, again, a simplistic solution to a more complex problem. Anyway, that's basically what I see. And again, populism is not necessarily destructive, but so often it is, because I think society right now, the globe is faced with a lot of fairly complex problems. And we're seeing the rise of all of these right-wing and left-wing populist, governments around the world, very much simplifying and not joining together to solve the problems. When you go back previous to 1400s or so, I would call that kind of the beginning, or 1400, beginning of the Renaissance, beginning of the Age of Enlightenment. And we see science, the third tool of science, which I call experimentation. That's really basically human beings have tried for, centuries, eons, to impose their views on nature onto the solution of problems. We live in a world where we have a certain worldview, and we think our worldview is right. We're absolutely sure of that. And I'm going to give you an example of me, because I've certainly been through that. When I was about 10 years old, my dad and I were walking home from a ball game and looked up in the sky, and there's this beautiful display of northern lights. I mean, it was gorgeous. And I said, Daddy, what causes those? And he said, it because of reflection off the polar ice caps. And I believed my dad. I mean, that was absolutely right. And that was part of my worldview. I believed it forever. And then when I was almost 30, I was doing my master's in physics, and I was out fishing with one of my instructors and on Lake Cormorant. And we looked up, and there's this beautiful display of northern lights again. And I said, isn't that amazing how that's caused by reflections off the polar ice caps? And I was pretty much laughed out of the boat. I mean, here I was, I had a degree in aerospace engineering, working on a master's in physics, and I was still believing what my dad told me. I mean, that was my worldview. That was part of it. Well, the thing is, now I know, once I went back and started reading and studying, it's caused by solar wind, this ionization and coming into our atmosphere, exciting the gas particles in the north and south, and it follows a magnetic field into the earth. Okay, that's the scientific explanation. But I didn't want to accept that. I thought, no, it's reflection off the polar ice cap because my dad told me that. So we all get locked into a worldview that we think is correct. And then we go around looking for information to support those worldviews. We want to find information that confirms what we believe. So we try and impose our information onto our own views, and that's not good for a solution. Well, when you go back to 1500, that started changing, especially in a lot of the universities and with the philosophers and so on at the time. We cannot impose our views onto nature. Nature has to be allowed to speak for itself. And we do that through experimentation. That's the third tool of science. That's one that really kind of set modern humans into a development of a description of nature that is fantastic where we are now. We really have a good not a great, but a pretty good understanding of a lot of the phenomena in nature. And later on, they found that scientific thinking is very close to good critical thinking. Because in thinking critically, so often we see an event happening in society or something, and we interpret that in terms of a simplistic view that follows our own views. We want to interpret everything in terms of our views. Okay, and a populist will use those ideas, and we see a complete rise because of modern technology. We see such a rise of media sources that reinforce various ideas, whether they're right or wrong. And we see that happening all over the world. Sometimes it's government controlled, sometimes it's economic controlled, and so on. And we see that. And the only cure for that, I think, is developing good critical thinking skills. And we don't see that as a strong, even in our educational system nowadays, we don't see that as much of a pursuit. We try and educate people in terms of having a good job when they get out. And a lot of places will educate people in terms of their own personal views. And that's really the cure for it. I think it was Ben Franklin who said after the Constitutional Convention, he walked out and he says, well, we've given you a democratic republic. Whether you can keep it is really unknown yet now. And I think both he, Jefferson, Horace Mann, most of the main educators and people in our society have found we got to educate the populace in terms of jobs and so on, but we really have to educate them in terms of liberal studies to understand history, understand science, understand economics, understand all these things, and not kind of delve into populism simplicity. Does that explain much?
That explains a lot. How do you suppose we develop critical thinking in not just our children, but in each other?
Yeah, I think one, I hope we start holding people accountable. I mean, right now we see so many falsehoods in our government, in our media, and so on. I mean, basically, I think that one of the popular ways of interacting with the extreme right or left populism is that it's based on lies. And I think good critical thinking skills can alleviate some of the way we see the world through those lies. I'll give you an example. I built an electric van, and I go to shows and show it and so on. And I was at a display one time, and a guy came by, and he was looking. He said, "I've got an idea for an electric van." He said, "I want to have an electric van, and then on each wheel, I'll put a generator. So as it's driving down the road, the wheels are generating electricity. And so we can pump that back into the battery, and it can keep going on and we don't have to put any power in it or any energy into it." And I said, well, that probably won't work because we have something called the second law of thermodynamics. It says you can't get more energy out of something than what you put into it. It's the most fundamental laws in physics there is. And I said, so that's been tried. It's called a perpetual motion machine, and it's been tried over and over and over again, and we can't do it. It's one of the most fundamental laws of physics that tells us that. Well, I told him that in more simplistic terms, but he got really angry at me. I mean, he said, no, it'll work. And he stormed off. He wasn't going to believe what I told him. And so we see that type of thing. Well, a good critical thinker would have said, oh, I didn't know that. Let me kind of check on that. Just like I'm hoping that what I say here, people will go check on and not believe everything I say. So I really think one of the things is fact checking. And we see some people on the national scale trying to do that. But if you're wrapped up in a perception, and you want to believe it, that fact checking doesn't do a whole lot of good.
Especially when we can't trust some of the sources. So if people are fact checking in a source that is aligned with their beliefs, so how do we even know where to fact check?
That's a very good question. And I wish I had an answer. The problem is that critical thinking will tell us to look at different sources of information. Don't just get stuck on one. But I've had, right-wing people saying that I watch Fox News. That's all I watch because they're right. No matter that, they paid out $750 million for lying to the American people, they still think they're absolutely right. And then we get back into that whole confirmation bias thing where because we think we're right, we look for. Now, if we teach good critical thinking skills, people say, yeah, I should check that with other sources. The problem coming from the web that it can offer so many different solutions, I guess, out there, and some are really based in different types of dogma. However, because we have those multiple websites and multiple sources, we can also check a lot of different sources and then try and which one has the best data. Another thing I always argue about is that you don't know how many people will tell me, well, it's just common sense. Common sense doesn't mean diddly. Because, when you look at science and how we built the description of nature, we had to go against common sense because common sense it tells one thing, but when we get into different levels of physics, it doesn't follow common sense. Nature has to speak for itself, just like solutions to a problem has to be allowed to speak for itself. We cannot impose our views on that. And that's your basic philosophy of critical thinking skills.
What do you mean by nature speaking for itself?
Well, I'll give you an example, and I'm going to try and describe an event here. Okay, we're going to go back to the Greeks because the Greeks did so much in formulating our description of nature. We still try and use that. We still almost bestow Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates with almost a mythical knowledge, which they certainly do not deserve. But one of the things that Aristotle thought that, okay, if I have a rock here, if I have a rock sitting in front of me and I push on it a little bit, it'll start moving, it'll start accelerating. Okay, if I push on it harder, it starts accelerating faster. If I push on it harder, it accelerates much faster. So he said that acceleration is dependent on the force pushing on it. Now that makes sense. But then when he said, okay, I'm holding two rocks in my hand, one is a light rock, one is a heavy rock. And because that heavy rock has a much greater force pulling on it, it must fall a lot faster. Just like horizontally, if I push on it with greater force, it accelerates faster. Therefore, the heavy rock must fall faster than the lighter rock. Now, that makes perfect sense. It's perfect sense. But the thing is, you got to drop the damn things. So you drop them and you say, hey, that's not what happens. They all fall at the same rate. Common sense has been proved wrong so often. So you have to ask nature. That's what an experiment is you're asking nature a question about how it works. And the most difficult thing about experimentation is interpreting the results and seeing how it works. Before when we were doing simple things like dropping rocks, it wasn't too bad. But now as we get into smaller and smaller and bigger, then the experiments become more difficult and interpreting the results of those. And that's really the art of science, I think. And then we can carry that over into critical thinking skills. Again, you don't know how many times people say, well, just common sense. That doesn't mean diddly to me. Well, how much is that common sense backed up with some type of facts or experimentation?
What's a summary of how we develop critical thinking skills themselves?
Well, one thing you have to realize, a lot of things really don't matter too much. I mean, if we live in a little bit of an illusion. I think all of us do. It's not going to matter a whole lot in your life. But when you get into areas that are matter, and I would say electing a representative or looking at the government we have or looking at our economic system, these things are all pretty important. And we see that how simplistic populism, and we're seeing this in this administration now, it's basically made up of simplistic populism. So then we should probably dig a little deeper. Now, the first thing in critical thinking, I think, is to say, maybe most things I believe are wrong. Because it's hard for a person to come to that because we all think we're pretty smart. I think individually we think, yeah, we read something, it's got to be true and so on. But really we're not. I mean, I think it was Shakespeare who said, and as you like it, the fool thinks themselves to be wise, where the wise person knows themselves to be a fool. And I think the big admitting we're pretty much all fools. And then going from there is the first start. And I think that it's hard for people to do that because if I see something obviously wrong, I'll try and correct it. Some people just get, like this guy did when I told him about perpetual motion machines, some people just get damn angry and just rattle on. I mean, I just ran into that the other day that I don't want to get into, but he just rattled around the whole building, was mad because I'd corrected him on something that he thought was absolutely right. I don't want to sound like a know-it-all either, but there are some things, especially in the area of science, that I'm fairly well acquainted with, that I do think I can offer corrections on. And then also I read a lot of history, which I think is probably the simple, most important thing to read so we can understand, where we're at. Because I think it was a great philosopher, Jorge Santana, who said, those who not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And we see that over and over and over again. We just keep repeating history and screwing things up.
Why do you think science is under such attack?
I think it's because it's coming out with descriptions of nature that people don't want to believe. It doesn't fit into their overall view, whether it be sometimes it's a religious view, sometimes it's a political view, sometimes it's an economic view. And when science conflicts with that, people don't want to accept it. And also, I don't think people understand science real well. I mean, you don't know how many times you see ads on TV that say, well, science is showing. That can be such a misused statement, and it's wrong. And a lot of times we confuse technology, the applications of science, with the science itself, and that is producing newer, better descriptions of nature. So I think it's a lot of it just not understanding science, and it also largely conflicts with a lot of people's personal views. I mean, we see an administration right now that completely mocks climate change. And that's because of their economic views, because we do have to change our perception of how our economy operates in a world filled with climate change in the process. And a lot of people don't want to do that. I would say that I'm impressed with the auto industry because they've really seen, okay, this is happening. And they went to a lot of redesigning cars and going to hybrids and electric and so on, which I think has been amazing. And I hate to see a really ignorant administration come in and reverse all that stuff. I think that's just an abomination. And we will pay for that as a country and as a world.
This has been awesome, Dennis. I knew it would be. Do you have anything else you want to share before we wrap this up?
No, except I want to repeat what I said before. Don't believe what necessarily I say or anybody else says. There are a lot of scientific fact out there that I try and use, but there's also a lot of opinion that I'm offering here that, look at it, look at history, look at social facts and so on. So anyway, and I don't know how strongly I can suggest that and then it's all part of the critical thinking process.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dennis, for joining the Global Grid Experience.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
That was Dennis Jacobs. Thanks, Dennis. And thank you all for being a part of the Global Grid Experience. This is all so much fun. I get so pumped bringing you interesting people. Thanks again for listening. Talk soon.